The first thing people noticed about Illyra was never her eyes. It was the skin. Not merely blue, but the deep, living blue of twilight over mountain ice, darkening at the throat and wrists to something richer, almost violet where blood ran closest beneath the surface. In summer heat it seemed to hold a cool sheen, as though the evening sky itself had settled over her bones. In winter it turned matte and dusky, like a storm waiting behind distant peaks. The second thing people noticed were the horns. They rose from just behind her temples in smooth black curves, elegant and severe, sweeping backward in a crescent line polished by years of rain, cloth, and careless stares. Travelers always looked twice. Children stared openly until their parents pulled them away. Drunk men asked rude questions and then regretted it when she answered them with a level gaze and a stillness that made them feel clumsy in their own skin. The third thing people noticed, if they stayed near her long enough, if they got past the spectacle of color and horn and otherness, was that she was gentle in ways the world did not deserve. That, more than anything, was what nearly got her killed. The village of Bracken Ford lay between a river and a forest that never stopped whispering, even in dry weather. It was one of those places that looked harmless from a distance. Smoke lifting softly from low stone chimneys, laundry snapping in the wind, goats nosing through kitchen gardens, children running with sticks in hand as if war had only ever been a game. But little settlements near the border survived by learning hard habits. Doors were barred before dark. Knives were kept sharpened. No one wasted grain. No one trusted soldiers, tacksmen, or priests who smiled too much. Illyra had lived there 3 years and 6 months, long enough that the old women in the bread line no longer crossed themselves when she passed, long enough that the miller's twins brought her armfuls of moss and wild garlic because they knew she paid in honey cakes, long enough that the villagers called her healer before they called her stranger. Her cottage stood at the edge of Bracken Ford where the road bent toward the woods. Ivy crawled over one side of it, and a row of herbs grew in clay boxes beneath the windows: feverfew, mint, widow leaf, black sage, dreamroot, comfrey, moon nettle. On good mornings the place smelled of warm bread, crushed stems, beeswax, and wood smoke. On bad mornings it smelled of blood, vinegar, and panic. This was a bad morning. Hold him down. I am holding him down. Well, he's still moving, so hold him better. He bit me. Then take it as a compliment and stop shouting. Illyra stood over a kitchen table with both sleeves rolled to the elbow, her dark braid falling over one shoulder, her hands buried in the business of saving old Tom Weaver's leg. Tom, who had spent 67 years being mule-stubborn about everything from weather signs to taxes, had slipped in his own loft and split his shin open on a broken grain hook. He had arrived cursing, bleeding, and refusing a stretcher because, according to him, only dead men let themselves be carried. Now he was pale as milk and sweating through his shirt while his daughter Mira and her husband tried to keep him from kicking the lamp off the table. "Tom," Illyra said, not looking up, "if you move again, I will let your son-in-law sing while I stitch you." Tom froze in honest horror. "You wouldn't." "I know 3 songs," the son-in-law said defensively. "You only know one, and it's filthy," Mira snapped. Illyra huffed a laugh through her nose and pressed a folded cloth to the wound. Blood seeped hot and dark between her fingers, smelling of iron and wet wool. Outside, rain tapped the shutters in a fine gray rhythm. The room was warm from the stove, crowded with bodies, and bright with the clean medicinal smell of boiled rosemary and spirits. Tom's pulse jumped beneath the line of her thumb. "It's deep," she murmured. "Not shattered." "That's luck." "Luck?" Tom barked. "I near saw my own bone." "Yes," she said calmly. "And now you won't. Be grateful and stop trying to die out of spite." He grumbled, but the fight went out of him a little. Illyra liked people best in these moments, not because they were weak, exactly, but because pain stripped pretense away. People stopped performing themselves while bleeding. They became immediate and honest and human in the oldest sense of the word. Her hands began to glow. Only faintly at first. A cool silver-blue light beneath her skin, outlining the long bones of her fingers and the delicate web of veins in her wrists. Mira sucked in a breath even though she had seen it a dozen times. Tom made the sign against evil by reflex, then looked embarrassed and turned it into a scratch at his chest. Illyra pretended not to notice. Healing, real healing, was never as dramatic as songs made it. There were no sudden thunderclaps, no golden halos, no wounds sealing shut in perfect silence while angels hummed in the rafters. Real healing was work. It was pattern and resistance. Flesh had memory, yes, but it also had stubbornness. Bones had to be coaxed into remembering their proper shape. Muscle had to be soothed out of spasm. Infection had to be fought with herb, heat, and patience. Magic helped, but it did not replace care. It sharpened it. The torn tissue beneath her palms tingled, then trembled. Tom clenched his jaw so hard she heard his molars click. "Breathe," she said. "I am breathing. Threats do not count as breathing." Mira laughed once, short and nervous. The son-in-law, still nursing a bite mark on his hand, muttered something about being blamed no matter what he did. The wound began to close. Not vanish, no good healer trusted magic that worked too fast, but pulled together with the neat, visible logic of mended cloth. Blood slowed. Ragged edges softened. Tom's face eased by degrees from battle-ready misery to the outraged confusion of a man whose suffering was ending before he had properly finished complaining about it. There came a knock at the door. No one moved. Another knock, harder. Mira frowned. "Who in rain like this?" "Someone with poor timing," Illyra said. The door opened anyway. Cold wet air spilled into the cottage, carrying the smell of horses, mud, leather, and sharpened steel. 3 riders stood in the doorway under dark cloaks beaded with rain. They did not look like tax men, priests, or merchants. They looked worse. Soldiers, then, but not in any colors Brackenford knew. The one in front pushed back his hood. He was young, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders and a face cut too harshly to be called handsome in any soft way. His hair was black with rain, tied loose at the nape. A white scar crossed one eyebrow. His eyes were amber gold, bright and strange enough that Tom's son-in-law made a tiny involuntary sound. Illyra's hands stilled. Not because of the man's face. Because of what pressed beneath it. Power. It rolled off him with the kind of disciplined violence she had learned to recognize before language, back in the high places where her people named such forces as if they were weather patterns. This was not ordinary authority. Not merely rank, or the confidence of a swordsman who had won more fights than he'd lost. This was older. Pack deep. Predatory. Controlled so tightly it only became more dangerous. One of the riders behind him shifted slightly, hand resting near the pommel of his sword. The man in front looked around the room, took in Tom bleeding on the table, Myra's white knuckles, the open jars, the light in Illyra's hands, and finally settled his gaze on her. "You are the healer," he said. "Not a question." Illyra lifted her chin. "I am." He stepped inside, bringing rain and mountain cold with him. "My captain is dying." Tom, incredibly, found the strength to protest. "I was here first." Mira hissed, "Father." The stranger's mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile. "The memory of one, perhaps. Then your timing is unfortunate." "Illyra," Mira said quietly, fear sharpening her voice now, "you don't know them." No, Illyra thought. But she knew wounds. And men who spoke like this did not ride village roads in weather like this for minor fevers. "Where is he?" The stranger turned his head. "Bring him." The 2 men outside hauled forward a 4th rider slumped half-conscious over a saddle. Blood had soaked the man's side and one thigh, black in the rain. He was older than the one who led them, heavily built, beard shot through with gray, jaw clenched in pain, even unconscious. The smell hit the room a second later. Not just blood. Rot. Poison. Illyra moved before fear had time to argue. Mira, clear the back room. Tom, if you can sit up and complain, you can survive on a stool for another hour. Tom spluttered indignation. Mira and her husband scrambled. The strangers carried their wounded captain inside. Boots tracked mud across the floor. Rain hissed on the hearthstone. The little cottage, already crowded, suddenly felt too small for everyone's breath. As they passed near her, the amber-eyed man stopped. What do you need? The question surprised her more than his entrance had. Most soldiers barked orders when afraid. They did not ask. Boiling water. More lamps. Clean cloth. And if any of your men faint at blood, they can do it outside. A sound came from one of the riders behind him that might have been a muffled laugh. The amber-eyed man nodded once. You heard her. Everything moved fast after that. Tom was settled in a chair with a blanket over his knees and an expression of personal betrayal. Mira set lamps. The son-in-law boiled more water and tried not to look heroic about it. The stranger took off his wet gloves and, when told, held the basin steady while Illyra cut the wounded captain's clothes away. The injury was ugly. A puncture beneath the ribs, but not clean. The flesh around it had blackened in branching lines, and the captain's breathing came too shallow, too fast. Poison again, but not one she recognized by smell. The man's pulse stumbled under her fingers like a horse on bad ground. He was hit with what? A hooked blade, the stranger said. The edge was black. Brilliant. That narrows it to every assassin worth hiring. He looked at her, and to her own annoyance she heard the sharpness in her voice and did not regret it. She needed facts, not awe. Can you save him? He asked. Ask me that after you tell me how long ago. 6 hours. Illyra sucked air through her teeth. Then maybe. The room fell quiet around that word. Maybe was not hope, but it was better than certainty in the other direction. She set to work. The poison resisted in a way that made her dislike it at once. It clung to tissue like spite, fighting every attempt to draw it free. She used vinegar, charcoal, crushed moon nettle, then magic. The silver-blue light brightened under her palms until the whole room carried a cool underwater glow. Sweat gathered beneath her braid. The smell of the wound grew sharper, foul and metallic. The captain convulsed. The stranger caught his shoulders before he could roll from the bedroll. Easy. Do not tell a dying man easy in that tone, Illyra snapped. He'll think you're a fool and die to avoid hearing you again. One of the soldiers choked on a laugh. The stranger, infuriatingly, did not flinch. What tone should I use? She spared him half a glance. Something less like a threat. His hand, broad and scarred, shifted on the captain's shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice lowered into something rougher, closer to human. Stay with us, Darren. There. Better. Illyra pressed harder, following the poison where it branched, burning with the effort of it. Magic rose through her chest like cold river water. Her horns throbbed faintly at the roots, a sign she was drawing too deeply, too fast. The cottage seemed to narrow to the wound, the pulse, the line between enough time and too late. Come on, she muttered to the broken body beneath her hands. You do not get to make me lose this argument. The captain's breathing hitched. Then steadied. The black lines stopped spreading. Illyra held there another long minute just to be sure, feeling the poisoned blood begin, begrudgingly, to yield. When she finally leaned back, the room swam. She caught the edge of the table to steady herself. He'll live, she said. No one spoke at first. Then Mira made a little sobbing sound of relief so fierce it startled a laugh out of her husband. Tom muttered, "Show off," from his chair. One of the soldiers crossed himself in a northern sign Illyra did not know. The amber-eyed man did not move right away. He was staring at the captain, or perhaps through him, at the fact of survival itself. Something tight around his mouth loosened by 1 degree. He looked older in that instant, and younger too, as if exhaustion and memory had both stepped close enough to be seen. At last he turned to her. "You have my thanks." Polite. Formal. Controlled. It ought to have ended there. Instead, because she had been awake since before dawn and was dizzy from magic and annoyed at being stared at by armed men in her own kitchen, Illyra said, "If thanks are all you brought, I prefer coin." The room went dead silent. Myra's eyes went enormous. The soldier with the almost laugh looked at the floor as if it had become urgently interesting. The amber-eyed man studied Illyra for one long, impossible heartbeat. Then he reached into his cloak, drew out a heavy leather purse, and dropped it onto the table with a clink that made Tom sit up straight in pure greed. "Will that do?" Illyra looked at the purse. Then at him. "Probably." "Good." He turned toward the door. That might still have been the end of it if thunder had not rolled across the valley and if, beneath it, there had not come the distant, unmistakable note of a war horn. All 4 soldiers went still. Not startled. Ready. The amber-eyed man crossed to the door and looked out into the rain. His shoulders changed. Every line of him sharpened. "What is it?" Illyra asked. He did not answer at once. One of his men had already stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Then the stranger said, "How many people in this village?" Mira answered before Illyra could stop her. 123. With children. He swore softly. And in that moment Illyra knew with the clean certainty of nightmare that whatever had followed these men to Bracken Ford had just arrived. The horn sounded again, closer this time. Outside, dogs began barking. Then screaming. The stranger turned back into the room, all the careful edges of civility burned away now, leaving only command. "Get everyone to the stone granary," he said. "Now." Mira stared. "What?" "Move." The force in his voice cracked through the room like an axe through wood. Tom lurched upright in pure reflex. Myra's husband nearly dropped the kettle. Illyra stepped between the stranger and the rest of the room before she quite realized she had done it. "Explain," she said. His eyes met hers. Bright amber. Hard. Alive with things he was not saying. "Men came after us. Not many, but enough. If they find us here, they will kill every witness." A second horn cut the rain. Shouts rose in the village square. The stranger looked past her toward the back room where his captain lay unconscious, then toward the window where torchlight was already moving through the rain-dark street. "We don't have time," he said. And because the world is cruel in ways that demand speed more often than justice, Illyra believed him. "Fine," she snapped. "Mira, get your father. Jorin, wake the square. Tom, if you complain while being rescued, I will sedate you." Tom drew himself up. "I have never once." Mira and Jorin hauled him bodily toward the door. Chaos flooded the cottage. The soldiers moved with frightening efficiency. One lifted the captain as though he weighed nothing. Another pushed tables against the windows. The almost laughing one drew both blades and took position by the door, listening to the shouts outside with the concentrated calm of a man already measuring where he would kill first. Illyra snatched her satchel from its peg, swept in bandages, salves, 3 knives, a packet of moon nettle, and the little carved bone charm she had kept since childhood, though she did not believe charms did anything but remind the hand to stay steady. The amber-eyed man watched her. "You're coming with us." I am not leaving those people. If you stay alone, you die alone. If I leave them, I deserve it. Something flashed across his face then, anger, maybe, but tangled with another feeling too fast to read. The almost laughing soldier pushed the shutter aside a finger's width. Riders. The street outside exploded into noise. People shouting. Hooves on mud. A woman screaming for her child. Steel ringing off stone. The stranger drew his sword at last. It came free with a low singing sound, dark metal catching firelight. Not ornate. Not ceremonial. A weapon made to end conversations permanently. He looked at Illyra and said, with the cold certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "Stay behind me." Then he kicked the door open and went out into the storm. The village of Bracken Ford had seen fights before. Drunk fights. Knife fights. A tax collector beaten with his own ledger. A winter wolf chased from a goat pen by 3 furious grandmothers with shovels. But battle was something else entirely. Battle had a different shape. It moved faster than thought and left less behind. Men on dark horses were already in the square, cloaked and masked, blades bare. Not a raiding party looking for grain. Not bandits hoping for easy coin. These riders came like professionals. Straight for the center, straight for the lanes that boxed civilians in, straight for the houses where doors were weakest. 2 villagers already lay in the mud. The stranger from Illyra's cottage hit them like a falling gate. He moved with brutal efficiency, no wasted flourish, no shouted challenge. One rider lunged from horseback and lost the arm that held the sword. Another took steel through the throat before he even registered resistance. Rain sheeted down around them, turning blood thin and black in the mud. His men fanned outward. One drove villagers toward the granary. Another took the alley near the well. The third, the one with the almost laugh, vaulted onto a cart and shot a masked rider clean out of the saddle with a compact recurved bow he had apparently produced from nowhere. Illyra did what healers do in disaster, she became the center and refused to move. Inside the granary, she shouted. Children first. If you can run, run. If you can't, get against stone. People listened because panic likes a voice with purpose. She dragged a boy with a split scalp behind the well wall, pressed cloth to the wound, shoved him toward his mother. She yanked old Ma Dessel clear of a bolting horse and got kicked hard enough in the thigh to make the world spark. She healed a butcher's hand enough that he could hold his own daughter again. She shouted until her throat went raw. Then one of the masked riders saw her. Of course he did. A healer in the open, blue-skinned and horned and glowing faintly in the rain, is impossible to miss. He changed direction at once, spurring his horse toward her through the mud. Illyra snatched up the fallen butcher knife at her feet, knowing even as she did that it would not be enough. The rider closed fast. Then the amber-eyed stranger was there between one blink and the next, catching the horse's bridle with one hand and driving his sword upward with the other. Man and beast screamed. The rider pitched sideways. The horse reared, nearly crushing them both, and the stranger shoved Illyra backward so hard she fell into the mud as iron-shod hooves struck sparks off the stones where her head had been a moment earlier. He killed the horse too. Quickly. Mercifully. Rain ran off his jaw in bright lines. Blood striped one sleeve. His breathing was hard but even. Stay, he said. Illyra spat wet hair out of her mouth. You keep saying that as though I'm a dog. His eyes flashed. No. As though you are the only healer in a village under attack. A scream tore through the square. Both of them turned. 3 masked riders had broken through near the granary. Villagers packed against the stone wall, nowhere left to run. A little girl in a red shawl stumbled in the mud and looked back, frozen. The stranger moved. So did Illyra. He swore when he realized she was beside him, but there was no time to argue. They reached the riders together, him in violence, her in reckless necessity. He cut one from the saddle. She flung a handful of powdered moon nettle into another horse's eyes. The beast shrieked and bucked, pitching its rider into the wall hard enough to crack skull on stone. The third turned toward Illyra with murder in his posture. And the air changed. Power slammed across the square. Not from the riders. From the stranger. It erupted out of him in a pulse so fierce that every horse reared and every villager within reach gasped as if the storm itself had become sentient. The rider's blade wavered. Just enough. The stranger stepped inside the stroke and drove his sword through the man's heart. Silence hit for one stunned second after. Not true silence. Rain still fell. People still sobbed. But the rhythm of battle had broken. The masked riders who remained looked toward the stranger now with something they had not shown before. Fear. One of them shouted, "It's him. Him." The stranger's face went very still. Then the riders fled. Not in orderly retreat. In ragged panic, hauling reins, wheeling into the rain-dark road, abandoning their dead in the mud. Within seconds the square held only villagers, bodies, the wounded, and the 4 strangers who had brought this storm to Brackenford. Illyra stood breathing hard, rainwater in her eyes, the borrowed butcher knife hanging useless at her side. Around them, the village groaned back toward life. A baby crying. Someone calling for blankets. Tom Weaver cursing because Mira had forced him to sit down. Jorin trying to count heads and failing every third number because he kept stopping to stare at the dead horses. The amber-eyed man wiped his blade once on a fallen rider's cloak and sheathed it. He turned to his men. Perimeter. If they circle back, I want warning. They obeyed immediately. Of course they did. Because only a fool, or someone nearly senseless with adrenaline, could miss what Illyra now understood. She looked at the men. Their discipline. The deference. The power that had rolled out of him like thunder wrapped in flesh. The rider's cry, "It's him." And then she looked at the stranger himself. "You," she said slowly, "are not just some soldier." His expression suggested he had expected this moment sooner. No. Mira, standing nearby with blood on her apron and rain dripping off the tip of her nose, stared between them. "Who is he?" The almost laughing soldier returned from the alley with a cut over one cheek and said, perhaps more proudly than was wise, that would be King Reeler of the North March. The entire square went still enough to hear the rain. Old Modessel actually sat down in the mud. Jorin said, in the tone of a man who wished very much to unsay a thing even while saying it, "Oh, hell." Illyra stared at the man she had charged coin from, insulted twice, and told not to sound like a threat while saving his captain. The King of the North March looked back at her with infuriating steadiness. "I had intended," he said, "to tell you after the poison was dealt with." She folded her muddy arms over her chest. Very thoughtful. "I do enjoy finding out after a battle that I've been ordering kings to carry basins." One of his soldiers made a strangled sound and looked away. To Reeler's credit, he did not become offended. He looked, if anything, a shade more tired. "If it helps, you were correct about the tone. That should not have been funny." Several villagers laughed anyway, the brittle relieved laughter that comes after horror when the body no longer knows what else to do. Illyra pressed fingers briefly to her eyes and let out a breath that might have become a laugh or a sob under different circumstances. "Your Majesty," she said at last, because now there was no avoiding titles, "why are assassins chasing you through my village?" His gaze shifted to the road where the last of the masked riders had disappeared into rain. "Because someone would like my captain dead," he said, "and me as well, if convenient." "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It is not." She lowered her hand. "Try again." For a heartbeat the square held only rain and smoke and the smell of blood. Then King Reeler looked at the villagers huddled near the granary, the bodies laid out with cloaks over their faces, the living wounded waiting for Illyra's hands, and some calculation changed behind his eyes. "My younger brother," he said quietly, "has decided he should wear my crown." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Political assassins. Succession struggle. Royal blood in muddy village streets. Brackenford had just become much more dangerous than wolves and taxmen. Mira whispered, "Saints keep us." "No saint within 20 miles, Tom muttered. "And if there were, they'd charge extra." "Even now, the old idiot." Illyra dragged a hand down her wet face. "Wonderful." Reeler's mouth flattened. "I did not mean to bring war to your door. Yet here it is." He accepted that without flinching. That, more than apology, made her look at him differently. Kings in stories came in two kinds. The glorious sort, too polished to be real, and the monstrous sort, so soaked in blood that no human shape remained beneath the crown. Reeler did not look like either. He looked like a man carrying responsibility the way soldiers carried old wounds, competently, painfully, and for far too long. "I can help the wounded," she said. "After that, you and I need to decide what to do with the fact that half the realm apparently wants your head." His brows rose slightly. "We?" "Yes, we. Because your enemies now know exactly where you were delayed, and I do not intend to wake tomorrow to find Brackenford burned for the sake of royal inconvenience." The almost laughing soldier actually smiled then, brief and fierce. "I like her." "Quiet, Tuvin," Reeler said. Tuvin did not look remotely chastened. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of triage. 3 villagers dead. 7 seriously wounded. 2 of the king's men cut but walking. Darren, the captain, still unconscious but stable. Illyra moved among them until her legs shook and her hands burned cold with overuse of magic. Reeler did not hover, which she appreciated, but he remained near whenever fighting might return. Once she found him kneeling in the mud beside a dead villager he could not have known, lifting the man's body with his own hands so it could be carried somewhere dry. Kings were not supposed to do that. At least, the ones in stories never did. By the time the rain eased toward dawn, Brackenford smelled of wet ash, churned earth, and the bitter herbs Illyra had emptied from half her shelves. The dead lay in the meeting hall. The wounded filled her cottage and Myra's and the miller's loft. People moved with that strange exhausted tenderness disaster sometimes creates, speaking too softly, touching too often, anger postponed because survival required collaboration first. Reeler found Illyra on the step outside her cottage just as she sat down hard enough to wince. She had blood on her sleeves, mud to the knees, and a headache sharpening behind her eyes. The sky over the trees had begun to pale, though the sun itself was still hidden. He stood a respectful distance away. "You should sleep," he said. She let out a humorless breath. "And you should be somewhere less assassinate-able. Since neither of us is getting what we should, sit or go away." A pause. Then, to her surprise, the king of the North March sat beside her on the damp wooden step. Up close, in the cold washed-out light before sunrise, he looked worn thin in places armor and command could not hide. Stubble darkened his jaw. A cut at his temple had clotted and then reopened in the rain. His hands, resting on his knees, were scarred in half a dozen old patterns. There was dried blood at the cuff of his sleeve that was not all his. For a moment neither spoke. Then he said, "My brother sent word 2 months ago asking me to come south and discuss succession concerns." Politely murderous. "Yes." She glanced at him. "And you went?" "I sent Darren instead." "That seems wise." It would have been, if the poison had stopped with him. She leaned her head back against the doorframe and closed her eyes briefly. "So what now?" Reeler was quiet long enough that she opened them again. I was on my way to the fortress at Harrow Peak, he said. There are lords there still loyal to me. If I reach them before my brother controls the passes, I can force this into open negotiation or open war, but at least on terms I know. And if you don't reach them? His face gave her the truth before his mouth did. Then the crown likely passes to a man who hires assassins. Illyra looked out over the muddy lane, the little gardens trampled by horses, the windows cracked by blades, the people she knew stumbling through shock because royalty had crossed their road. She thought of the riders' masks, of how quickly they had turned on villagers as obstacles rather than innocents. She thought of what would happen if that kind of rule spread unchecked. I suppose, she said slowly, this is where a sensible woman stays home and protects her village. It is, Reeler agreed. And yet, he echoed. She turned to look at him fully. How many healers do you have? He huffed what might have been the beginning of a laugh. 1 competent battlefield surgeon. 2 well-meaning butchers. And now, possibly, a blue-skinned woman too stubborn to leave danger alone. That last one sounds unreliable. Terribly. She held his gaze. Something shifted there. Not merely gratitude. Interest. Recognition. The dangerous beginning of trust. I can't leave Brackenford undefended, she said. But if your enemies are moving through these roads, staying here may not protect them anyway. If I come, and if you survive, you'll station a guard here until the succession is settled. Yes. You'll pay for every shattered door, every dead goat, and the grain you trampled tonight. Reeler blinked once. Dead goat? There were goats. Try to keep up. Yes, he said, and now he was definitely suppressing a smile. You'll also write down the recipe for that northern salve your captain carries. It smells foul, but it sealed a puncture better than anything I've seen from the valley. He actually laughed then, low and tired and real. It changed his whole face in a way she disliked for how much she noticed it. Done. Illyra stood. Her knees objected. She ignored them. Then congratulations, Your Majesty. You've acquired a healer. Reeler rose too. And what have you acquired? She looked at the mud, the blood, the paling sky, and the impossible road opening before her. A problem, she said. A large one. He inclined his head. I can't argue that. By noon, she had arranged what she could. Mira would manage the wounded who could be managed without magic. Tom, once the pain left his leg, became insufferably useful and took charge of supplies with the tyrannical joy of a man who had discovered fresh purpose. Tuvin and another of the king's men remained behind with 10 village volunteers to reinforce the road watch until soldiers from the North March could arrive. Illyra packed light. Herbs, bandages, knives, a spare dress, a winter cloak, the bone charm, 2 coils of thread, a whetstone, and a pouch of dried pears Mira pushed into her hands while trying not to cry. You do realize, Mira said thickly, that if you come back dead I'll never forgive you. That seems difficult to enforce. Mira burst into tears anyway and hugged her so hard one of Illyra's horns nearly caught in her hair. Jorin kissed Illyra's hand in awkward gratitude. Tom gripped her shoulder and said, gruffly, bring back the coin first, then your skin. In that order. I am deeply touched, Illyra said. Reeler waited by the horses, already mounted, rain-dark cloak snapping in the wind. Darren, pale but alive and furious at being bedridden, had to be lashed into his saddle with dignity preserved only by everyone's collective refusal to comment. When Illyra stepped into the square with her satchel slung across her chest, the villagers fell oddly quiet. Not because they disapproved. Because departures always sound a little like funerals until proven otherwise. Reeler held out a gloved hand to help her mount behind him. She looked at it. Then at him. This is temporary, she said. Of course. I am not swooning into your arms because you're a king. I would be concerned if you did. And if you ride too fast, I'll throw up on your cloak. At that, Tuvin barked a laugh from where he leaned against the granary. Even Darren, half dead and strapped upright, made a pain sound suspiciously like amusement. Reeler's eyes warmed. I'll take the risk. Illyra put her hand in his and let him pull her up behind him. The road north climbed through wet pines, over ridges where wind smelled of stone, and along old military tracks cut so close to sheer drops that Illyra avoided looking down when possible. They rode hard, stopping only to water the horses, tend Darren, and sleep in shifts beneath rock overhangs or in abandoned shepherd huts that smelled of lanolin and old storms. Travel strips people into their practical selves. There is not much room for performance when everyone is cold, hungry, dirty, and uncertain who might be following. Reeler, she learned, spoke little by habit rather than pride. When he did speak, it was usually because he had decided silence no longer served. He rode with the tireless competence of a man who had spent more of his life on campaign than in comfort. He took first watch more often than anyone else. He checked every horse himself in the evenings. He listened when people answered him. This should not have been remarkable in a king, but apparently it was. He also had a temper. Not an uncontrolled one. That might have been easier. His was the colder kind, the kind that sharpened him instead of clouding him. It surfaced once when Tuvin nearly reopened Darren's wound by trying to help him down from a slope too quickly. Reeler's voice dropped so low it made even the trees seem to lean in, and Tuvin, who feared almost nothing alive, went still as a rabbit under hawk shadow. Later, when they made camp, Illyra found Reeler alone near the fire, staring into it. You terrified him, she said. He did not look up. Good. No. Not good. Effective, perhaps. But if your men fear you more than they trust you, they'll start lying to avoid your displeasure, and then everyone dies stupidly. His jaw tightened. She folded herself onto a fallen log opposite him, ignoring the way sparks moved gold across his face. You can glare at me if you like. I've already charged you for insolence once. At that, his mouth twitched. You truly do not care who I am. I care exactly who you are. That's the problem. He looked at her then. The wind shifted. Pine smoke curled between them. Somewhere beyond the ring of firelight a night creature cried out once and fell silent. And who am I? He asked. The question was too large for the hour. Too honest. Illyra rubbed her chilled hands together before answering. A man carrying a kingdom like a wound he doesn't trust anyone else to touch. Reeler held still. Then, after a long time, he said, that is inconveniently perceptive. I charge extra for that too. This time he did smile. It happened more often after that, though always rarely enough to matter. At Harrow Peak they found the gates closed. Not hostile. Worse, uncertain. The fortress perched above a narrow gorge, all black walls and iron pennants. Men watched them from the battlements but did not open immediately. News had outrun them. Rumors too. Perhaps even lies. Reeler rode to the gatehouse with his hood thrown back, making himself unmistakable. His voice carried upward, iron over stone. I am your king. Open. There are moments when history narrows to hinges. The silence that followed felt endless. Then gears turned. Chains rattled. The gates opened inward. Inside waited Lord Sereth of Harrow Peak, broad-faced, grey-bearded, a man old enough to remember Reeler's father. He knelt. Relief did not show much on Reeler's face, but Illyra felt it in the way his shoulders lowered by 1 degree. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and would have killed her with boredom if not for the constant threat of treachery underneath them. Lords came. Oaths were weighed. Messengers arrived breathless with reports of roads seized, garrisons wavering, villages burning where loyalty was uncertain. Reeler moved through it like a blade through cloth, precise and tireless, but every night he returned more worn. So did she. The wounded from skirmishes filled Harrow Peak's lower halls. Arrow tears. Crushed hands. Sword cuts. Fever from bad water in the outer barracks. Illyra worked until the fortress began to smell less of old blood and more of boiled thyme and clean linen. Men who had looked at her horns with suspicion on the first day began asking, gruffly, if she had more of the poultice, the blue lady, used on tendon strain. By the sixth day, she had started shouting at noble sons and veteran captains with equal disregard, which seemed to win a strange kind of respect. Reeler watched all of this. Once, late, she found him in the infirmary doorway after midnight. Snow had begun outside, soft and dry, hissing against the shutters. He stood with one hand on the frame, looking at the rows of sleeping wounded. "They are quieter," he said. "Because they're not fevering." "No," he said. "Because they believe they'll live." Illyra set down the bandage she was folding. "That tends to calm people." He came farther in, stepped slow on the stone. "When I was a boy, our halls after battle sounded like this too." "Too?" He nodded once. "Before my father died. Before every campaign became an exercise in proving hardness." She understood then that they had reached one of those invisible places where truth either deepens or retreats forever. She could joke. She could turn away. She did neither. "And your brother?" she asked. "What does he believe?" Reeler's gaze stayed on the sleeping men. "That mercy is weakness and that fear is the cleanest form of rule." The words opened quietly between them, and she saw at once what lay beneath them, not only political difference, but inheritance. Two sons of the same brutal education who had walked away with opposite conclusions. One decided pain must be wielded harder. The other had come to suspect pain multiplied itself unless someone chose, at cost, to stop it. "You're going to beat him," she said. Reeler looked at her. "That sounds dangerously like confidence." "No. It's exhaustion. I'd rather not do all this twice." His laugh, when it came, was low and startled and lovely enough to annoy her. Then his face sobered. "Illyra." The way he said her name changed the room. She did not move. He came to stand beside the nearest infirmary cot, close enough that she could see the lines fatigue had etched around his eyes. Beyond the shutters the snow kept falling, turning the world white and quiet outside while the fortress breathed heat and hurt within. "There have been very few honest things in my life these past years," he said. "Very few people I could not afford to doubt." The pulse in her throat tripped once. "This is a terrible beginning," she said softly. "It is the only one I have." "Then continue." His eyes held hers. Amber, gold, something warmer now in the lamplight. "When I rode into Brackenford, I expected a healer. Useful hands. A service purchased, thanked, and left behind." He drew a measured breath. "Instead I found a woman who insulted me while saving my captain, argued with me while my enemies closed in, and then followed me into a civil war because she could not bear to let frightened men bleed alone." Illyra's mouth curved despite herself. "You make me sound unwise." "I am not finished." The humor thinned between them, leaving only the dangerous tenderness underneath. "I have come to depend on your judgment," he said. "To look for you after every council, every skirmish, every dawn we survive. I hear your voice correcting my worst instincts long after you have left the room." His expression shifted, softened into something so unguarded she felt it all the way to her bones. "And when I thought those riders in Brackenford might kill you, I was afraid in a way battle has not made me in years." The infirmary seemed to contract to the space between them. She should have answered quickly. Instead she let herself feel the full weight of what he had placed in her hands: honesty without title, desire without command, need spoken as need. At last she said, "Good." He blinked. "Good? Yes. It's indecent that I've had to suffer this alone." For one heartbeat he simply stared. Then he laughed, hand going briefly to his brow as if she had struck him there. "You impossible woman. I'm relieved you've noticed." His hand fell. "Illyra." This time when he said her name, there was no title in the room, no king and subject, no healer and warlord. Only a man asking without yet asking. She crossed the space first. Not because she was braver. Because she was tired of the cost of waiting. When she touched his face, he went utterly still. Warm skin. Evening stubble. The scar at his brow. The faint roughness of wind-chapped cheek under her thumb. His eyes closed for one tiny instant, not in control, but in relief. "This," she whispered, "is still a terrible idea." "Yes. I'm saying yes anyway. I had hoped." Then he kissed her. It was not polished. Not courtly. It tasted of fatigue and winter and restraint finally breaking open. One of his hands came to rest against the curve of her waist with a care so instinctive it almost undid her. She rose onto her toes, one palm sliding to the back of his neck, and the sound he made was quiet and rough and real. When they parted, both of them were breathing harder. A wounded soldier somewhere behind them snored like a saw through damp wood, and the absurdity of being tender in a room full of half-healed men nearly made her laugh. Wheeler pressed his forehead lightly to hers, careful of her horns. "When this is over," he said, voice low, "I would ask you properly." She searched his face. "Properly? For whatever future you might be willing to imagine with me." "A dangerous proposal, Your Majesty." "I might demand terms." "I expect it." She smiled then, small and helpless and entirely his undoing if the look on his face meant anything. The war ended not with one grand battle, but with 3 fast, ugly engagements and a surrender at dawn. Wheeler's brother, Kalen, had support enough for ambition but not enough for endurance once Harrowpeak declared publicly. 2 border lords switched sides when they realized the crown would not fall quickly. The southern pass closed under snowfall, trapping half Kalen's hired blades away from the capital. One of his own captains turned witness in exchange for his family's safety. Treachery, like disease, often begins from within. The final confrontation took place in the old throne hall at Northwatch Keep. Illyra was not there for the sword point, though she heard the aftermath in every corridor. 2 brothers in the same ancestral room. One kneeling, disarmed and bleeding. One standing over him with the choice all rulers eventually meet: mercy, justice, or some ugly thing between. Wheeler did not kill him. Many expected he would. Some wanted it. Instead Kalen was stripped of title, confined under guard to a remote monastery fortress where every letter in or out would be read by 3 hands before moving an inch. It was not kindness. It was deliberate refusal to feed the cycle that had made both of them. When Illyra heard, she sat very still. Was it wrong? Wheeler asked that evening, when the hall had emptied and victory still tasted more like ash than glory. She stood near the high window in his war room, watching the last of the snow melt off the battlements. Behind her, maps lay open on the table where they had spent weeks measuring roads, loyalties, grain, death. "No," she said. "Was it easy?" He let out a breath that might have become a laugh in another life. "Not remotely." Then it was probably right. She turned. He looked tired enough to break, and proud enough not to admit it. There was dried blood at his cuff again. His crown sat ignored on the table behind him, as though even now it were merely another burden set down between tasks. Illyra crossed the room, took it up, and weighed it in both hands. Gold, black iron, amber set at the brow. Beautiful. severe. Heavy. You wear this badly, she said. Reeler stared. That may be the first time anyone has told me so. Yes, well. They're cowards. She set the crown aside and rose to kiss him, and when his hands found her waist he held her not like a prize, not like salvation, but like home discovered unexpectedly and cherished for the shock of it. Spring came late to the North March that year. But it came. Roads reopened. Refugees returned to half-burned villages with wagons of timber and seed grain from the crown stores. Harrow Peak sent masons south. Brackenford received soldiers, supplies, 2 new granaries, and enough compensation for dead goats that Tom Weaver became insufferable for a full month. Mira wrote twice a week. Once to report that Jorin had fallen off a roof trying to repair storm damage and demanded Illyra's superior salve by courier. Again to say the Millers twins now boasted that they personally knew a queen, which caused fights in the schoolyard and enormous local prestige. I am not a queen, Illyra muttered, reading the letter by the palace fire. Reeler, seated nearby with a pile of reports and the expression of a man contemplating murder by bureaucracy, glanced up. Not yet. She lowered the page slowly. That sounded suspiciously planned. He set down his pen. It happened in the great courtyard under evening bells. Not because he wanted spectacle, though the court would later retell it often enough to make it sound that way. It happened there because the day had run long, because he had just come from hearing petitions about bridge repairs and grazing rights, because she had spent the afternoon elbow-deep in herb stores for the palace infirmary, because life is rarely tidy enough for perfect romance and had nonetheless become beautiful in spite of itself. The courtyard smelled of stone warming after rain, horses, early blossoms climbing the south wall, and supper smoke from the lower kitchens. Courtiers crossed in murmuring pairs. Guards stood at the gates. Somewhere above, swallows dipped through the last gold light. Reeler stopped her halfway across the flagstones. Illyra. She turned, a basket of dried roots still looped over one arm. If this is about the feverfew inventory, I can explain. He took the basket from her and handed it blindly to a passing page, who nearly dropped dead on the spot from terror and excitement. Then the king of the North March went down on one knee. The courtyard stopped breathing. Illyra stared. Reeler looked up at her, utterly unconcerned with the fact that 50 people had just forgotten how to move. You once told me you would demand terms, he said. Her heart had become a useless, startled thing in her chest. This seems an unfair time to negotiate. I disagree. There are witnesses. A laugh escaped her, wild and helpless. He drew a ring from his pocket. Not a delicate court ornament, but a band of dark silver worked with tiny mountain laurel leaves and one amber stone that glowed like captured fire. I have no intention of asking you to stand beneath me, he said, and though his voice was pitched for her, the whole courtyard heard every word. Not in rule, not in life, not in any room either of us enters. I ask you to stand beside me. Challenge me when I become a fool. Remind me what mercy costs and what cruelty does. Build with me what our fathers did not. Choose me, if you still can. People around them had gone so quiet she could hear a groom crying softly somewhere by the stables. Illyra looked at the ring. At the king on one knee before a blue-skinned woman with horns and herb dust on her sleeves. At the court frozen between scandal and worship. At the sunset burning along the western wall. Then she smiled, slow and luminous as if dusk itself had bent into human shape. Yes, she said. But I reserve the right to call you a fool in private and in public. Relief shattered across his face, bright and young and unkingly. Agreed. When he rose and kissed her, the courtyard erupted. Applause, laughter, one scandalized gasp, several cheers from the guard line, and, most piercing of all, the clear delighted whistle of Tuvin, who would later claim the moment as personal vindication of his early observations. The wedding, when it came, was less solemn than the priests preferred and more alive than the court expected. Illyra wore blue so deep it made the sky jealous. Silver thread traced old patterns from her mountain-born people along her sleeves and hem. Her horns were wrapped at the base with white laurel and tiny amber chains that clicked softly when she turned her head. R'hllor, seeing her at the chapel doors, forgot the first line of his vows and had to begin again while half the assembled nobility pretended not to notice. Mira cried openly. Tom cried while pretending dust had gotten in his eyes. Darren, fully recovered and back in uniform, stood as grim as a carved saint until Illyra caught him smiling at one point and he immediately looked offended by his own face. Tuvin smiled enough for 3 men. When vows were spoken, they were simple. No grand claims that love would conquer everything. No lies about never wounding one another by accident or history or fear. Only this, that they would return, and return, and return again to the work of choosing each other with honesty. Years later, songs would make it prettier than that. Songs always do. The truest changes came after. The palace infirmary doubled in size and then doubled again. Rural healers received crown stipends to train apprentices instead of aging into silence alone. Military doctrine changed, not toward softness, as the old hawks complained, but toward sustainability. Soldiers were taught to report infection early. Supply lines began carrying medicinal herbs as carefully as arrows. Children in court no longer learned that stoicism meant suffering in silence. They learned that strength sometimes sounded like asking for help before blood loss made speech impossible. Brackenford gained a proper stone clinic with windows that caught morning sun and herb boxes under every sill. Tom Weaver tried to rename it after himself until Mira and the rest of the village threatened mutiny. It was eventually named the Blue House despite Illyra's protests. As for the Queen herself, the people never quite stopped staring at first. Queens had been many things in the North March: fair-haired, dark-haired, foreign, pious, conniving, beloved, despised. None had ever been blue-skinned with black horns curving like moon-swept branches over a face that could go from clinical severity to laughter in a single breath. Children loved her immediately. Courtiers took longer, but fear melts quickly when someone saves your daughter from a winter fever or your son from a bad cavalry fall. And the king? The king learned to laugh in public. Not constantly. That would have been alarming. But enough that people began telling stories about the change in him as if it were weather too, how he bent to hear petitioners clearly, how he no longer mistook silence for loyalty, how his worst tempers were now often interrupted by the low dry voice of his queen from somewhere nearby saying, "Do stop looming. It makes everyone stupid." He was still dangerous. Still a man the realm thought twice before crossing. Mercy had not made him less formidable. It had made him more precise, because now when he used force, it was not to prove hardness. It was to protect something living. On summer evenings, when court was done and the heat withdrew from the stones, he and Illyra sometimes walked the upper walls together. From there the whole capital spread below like a bowl of firelight. Roofs, chimneys, river, market squares, the distant sound of bells and cartwheels and people still stubbornly building ordinary lives no matter what kings did above them. One such evening, years after blood and rain had first brought him to her cottage door, R'hllor leaned his forearms on the parapet and looked out over the city. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Illyra, beside him, was shelling roasted chestnuts into a folded cloth because apparently queens were allowed to do that if they ignored enough scandalized looks from passing nobles. "Marrying you? Following me out of Brackenford? Stepping into all this?" She considered the question properly. Below them, music floated from a tavern near the river. The sky was deepening toward violet. Wind moved gently over the city, carrying smoke, summer dust, and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers from the palace gardens. "At least twice a week," she said. R'hllor turned to stare at her. Then she smiled and pressed a chestnut into his hand. "I regret the meetings." The silk collars. Tuvin singing. The time you tried to fix a saddle buckle yourself and nearly dislocated your thumb. The appalling amount of parchment involved in ruling anything larger than a goat path. Her smile softened. I do not regret you. Something in his face eased at once, some old held breath he still had not entirely unlearned. He took her hand, rough and warm and familiar now in the ways that matter most. You remain impossible. And yet you remain here. I remain devoted. A stronger ailment than poison, apparently. He laughed, and the sound moved out over the wall into the twilight city below. Illyra tilted her head against his shoulder, her horns catching the last thin ribbon of sunset, and together they watched the lamps come on one by one across the kingdom they had, by blood and stubbornness and tenderness, learned to keep alive.